Hello and welcome to the Deadbeat Philosophy Podcast. I'm your host, Dave Baumeister, and today it's my great pleasure to have on the pod my good friend, Russell Duvernoy. Russell is a philosopher like myself who's very interested in questions of nature and human experience, in the relationship between philosophy and adjacent disciplines, including art and literature. And Russell and I also have other things in common, including being expatriates, Americans stranded in other lands and doing philosophy there in different ways. So in our conversation, we cover a lot of ground amongst all those topics, especially around the arts, the relationship between philosophy and art, feelings and what they are. We talk some about Kant, about Zen, about Japanese philosophy, and a good amount about death and memory. So I hope you enjoy this conversation. Thanks for tuning in. And here we go with Russell Duvernoy. Russ, how you doing, buddy?
I'm doing well. I'm happy to be here. Thanks for inviting me. And it's good to see you.
Yes.
And it's the wonders of modern technology. We can talk across space and time. Well, I guess not time, across all this vast space together. So it's quite cool.
Exactly, but still synchronized in some regards. So
Yes.
it'd be nice to be able to reach out and touch you, but I'll settle for this. And actually, this reminds me, I'm going to reach out. I have another Russell here.
Okay.
Like I can't resist just to open this. So this guy, this is Russell, or if you can see it on if you're on YouTube, but it's a Cabbage Patch Kid here. This is from my childhood. It's called Russell. He was like my stuffy when I was very little, and I took him to bed. And so I remember when I first met you, what would that have been? 13 years ago.
Yeah.
And you
2011.
came 2011. Yeah. And when you came to visit University of Oregon, and I really liked you just because of your name, because you had this association here. So
Okay.
I don't know.
Good. I haven't heard that one before, so that's great.
Very good. Did you have a childhood stuffed animal of any kind?
Yes, I had a stuffed bear that I called Leaner because it leaned to the side a little. But we weren't super close.
Okay.
Yeah.
It was always kind of leaning away.
There was probably an earlier bear from like a legitimate bear that I really loved, but when I was really little. And then Leaner was later. It was like I was getting a little old for stuffies, but I got a gift. So then I was like, eh. And so it was more like a character than a real connection. Yeah.
I hear you. Well, we all need some of those as well, right? I mean,
yes.
So, what sort of things are you thinking about these days? So maybe like, you're not thinking about Leaner. You probably haven't thought about Leaner in a while. But
no, I have to answer the question. Yeah.
So, like you're an active, this is like a philosophy channel. You're an active professional philosopher. Like, you and I both did our PhDs at the same place, and you're kind of one of the few who's stuck it out and who, got a secure permanent job. You're doing the thing. You are there in Canada. Why don't you give us just a nutshell of who you are and what your interests are as a philosopher?
Sure. Yeah. So, I'm a philosopher or a philosophy professor. I'm not sure if there's a difference. And I'll kind of work backwards. So right now I'm in a small liberal arts school named King's University College, which is in London, Ontario, which is in southwestern Ontario. And it's an affiliate of a university called Western University. One thing that's interesting about that is that the reason it's called Western University, if you look on a map, London's not in the west of North America, but at the time that the university was created, it was the west of Canada. So it's so that's kind of cool.
So kind of like Northwestern University in Chicago.
Exactly, similar deal. Yeah, and we're the same neck of the woods, same bioregion in a certain regard, the Great Lakes region. And I moved here with my family 5 years ago for the job during COVID. It was actually fairly dramatic. I got the job offer by paper. I was, the contract was sent to me. We were living in Seattle, and I signed it because I was, very focused on getting a tenure track job, and that it happened miraculously. And went to the post office to mail it, and it was starting to get a little weird. This is, I can't remember the exact date either. I think early March 2020, and people were starting to be kind of weird in public. And I, went home, and then like 3 days later is when everything shut down basically, and COVID started, like the real intense COVID. So that was, it was like fortuitous that all the other searches that the university was having were frozen, but mine, I got the job. But then we had to get across, do the
just
move
in time,
and
huh? It was like Indiana
stuff.
Jones slipping under the big
Exactly.
stone door just before it slammed shut, right? Yeah.
Yes. But the move was, I mean, maybe not. I don't need to go into all the details, but so it's taken about 5 years to start to get adjusted to this place as a place. Places may be important to me as a philosopher, but also as a person, because I'm interested in questions of environment and nature, and how we feel connected to places in deep ways, if we do. So it's a little ironic. I really don't have deep roots in Ontario, and I'm from the United States, as you know, originally, and it's very different here than the Pacific Northwest where we met. It's very flat. The scale of wildness is different, so you have to sort of shift your scale. There's not like grand mountains and wilderness, but there is a lot of beauty, so we're now Great Lakes people, I guess. That's where we live, London is about, I'm going to say driving distance, 2 hours from the U.S. border. So quite close.
Okay.
And
so near enough that you can kind of sneak over if you really need some American junk food or something that you can't get up there.
I mean, there's a lot of crossing, and so the birds fly across the lakes, they just go back and forth. We're right between two big lakes, the Lake Huron and Lake Erie, and then we got Lake Ontario. So it's the lakes here. The lakes are the kind of defining feature of the region.
Sure. Do you have a favorite lake?
Well, we haven't been to Lake Michigan or Lake Superior yet. I like wildness, or what I conceive of as wildness. So I'd like to visit Lake Superior, but right now Lake Huron is our favorite because we can it's a bit less developed than Lake Erie. Lake Erie has its charms as well. Okay. Those are the two we go to. Yeah.
Very good. Yes.
Yeah. And,
what do you think? Well, just on that topic of being an expat, that's something I'm definitely interested in as, an American living here in Germany, and who, move maybe for different reasons, for my partner's career, but similarly with a family, and also in that COVID time where I think like the pandemic loosened things up and, established different priorities for people. And a lot of people did move and lives got shuffled around. I mean, it sounds like had the pandemic not happened, you guys still would have moved where you moved because the job and that shift predated it. But nonetheless, it's like the sense of transformation and disruption. It's like then after, when the dust settled after the pandemic, just people were scattered elsewhere, institutions had shifted. And, I found myself here in Germany, and I'm still coming to terms with exactly what that looks like and just thinking about my identity. So like, what do you think about, do you like being an expat? Do you think about yourself that way?
Yeah. I love the question. It's a great question. I was an expat before, so I lived for 3 years in a previous chapter in the Czech Republic in, when was that? Like 2002, 3, and 4. And I enjoy being an expat. So we could talk about this a lot, but I will say that when we first got the job and we're planning to move, and I apologize right now to all my Canadian friends and Canadian listeners, but I didn't really conceive of it as moving to another country. I basically thought it was more or less the same. And so when I did move, because it didn't seem like far away and they spoke English and that sort of thing, right? So I was like, well, it's not going to be like moving truly to a different country, but it very much was, in ways that are really hard to describe. In fact, whenever we go back to the US, and Molly had my wife Molly had the same experience, and we would try to say we feel like, and it was also during COVID, so things were kind of bizarre anyway, but like I kept having this feeling of like, where am I? Like I couldn't quite figure out where I was, and things were just like very, very similar but different, kind
of like a bizarro world.
Yeah, I was just like, and I guess it comes up in my teaching a lot, because there's lots of like cultural things that the students are almost all either Canadian or international, but not from the US, from China or Southeast Asia, or so in any case, but the bulk are Canadian, and there's just little things, I think, kind of more like interpersonal cultural things that are, as I said, hard to describe. And so where it comes up for me now, I mean, for me, it's fine. I've always enjoyed travel, and I feel
you're no stranger to new places, or
yeah, exactly. And I think
you're not allergic to that. Yeah,
I'm not allergic to it. We moved a lot growing up in the US as well, but a place that comes up for me is my kids. Because both of them were born in the US, but they're young, and we go back and forth a lot to visit family, and it's relatively easy to do it. So they have an interesting, like, when I was their age, I wasn't thinking about borders or national identity and these sorts of things. And I'm letting them decide for themselves, but, they have a kind of like, well, we're American, but they sing the Canadian national anthem. They go to Canadian public school. They're really being raised in Canada, right? So that'll be interesting to watch. I'll be happy to be able to talk with them and more, to continue to sort of discuss that and share and think about that as we all get older.
Totally. Yeah. And who knows if it'll get more or less turbulent, it's like US Canadian relations.
Yes, exactly.
It's like, well, that, being like national, having dual nationality in those two places, I think was pretty seamless before, right. Or at least that was my sense, and it gets rockier. And same thing here in Germany. I mean, right now, the German political establishment doesn't know if they can trust the United States anymore, and those relationships are crumbling. And so, but just on a more everyday personal level, international families and people like myself, it's like, well, what does that mean? Like, yes. I do, you mentioned that with teaching, that makes me think that the classes I teach here, I teach either at the university to undergraduates who are primarily German, though not exclusively. And then I teach at a community college, a Volkshochschule here, like a philosophy course, and those are, kind of older German retirees for the most part. And it's interesting, both these groups, and being American and them knowing that I'm American, and we talk about the US while we're talking about other stuff, and I bring it up, but just their kind of interest in America, but also their like shock at America and disappointment, or all the emotions they have with regards to things, kind of emerge in how we interact. So it is a real interesting time to be an American, I think, in other places, but it seems to make it a bit more fraught. It's definitely becoming more fraught.
Yes. I was living in Prague, in the Czech Republic, and I was teaching in high school when which one was it? The second Gulf War, I guess, started, which was in 2003, I believe. When
okay, that was like the weapons of mass destruction.
Actually, 2002. Yeah, it was 2002, I think. But and I remember, I mean, some of this is really about me and my own peculiar psychology, because I never really felt connected to the nation state. But that's not really up to us. We are connected to the nation state in some way, right? I mean, But I remember I was teaching at a high school, and the Czech students, their parents were asking the students if I felt safe, which is very strange, because now and I was like, well, yeah, I was just so naive, and so I guess the word people like to use these days is privileged, but maybe just ignorant is a better word. Mm-hmm. That I was like, well, yeah, why wouldn't I be? But then, no less safe than normal, or right. I mean, there's always a certain degree of, but because this had sort of intensified the politics or because it was a controversial action, and there were massive demonstrations in the US as well. But another thing I think that's probably interesting that I think is I always find interesting about being an expat is the different media sources that you get and the different kinds of conversations. When I lived I keep going back to this over 20-year example, but
no, it's a good one.
Yeah. When I lived there was one thing that was utterly fascinating. So the Czech, this was in the 2000s, and they had this one public TV station that every night played the public news from 20 years previous.
Okay.
And it was like a remembrance of what the news was like when they were under communism. And so I used to watch this with just utter fascination, and my Czech wasn't great, and I would watch it, and then I would see, so this was and it was sort of, I had lots of conversations about this, about how constrained the media was and how controlled it was. And I would watch it, and they would be reporting on things that were happening in the US, like labor strikes in Detroit, which I kind of remember as a kid in the early 80s, that there was this labor movement and it was some labor unrest. Of course, it gets not really reported on very much in the US media, right? But it was being heavily emphasized by the Czech, which was really, in a sense, the Soviet media. And it was just, and I was watching it also I love, time. It was also like 20 years earlier. So it wasn't the current news. I'm wandering a little, but just, I imagine that this is something, I think it's one of the things that's really valuable about being an expat. Or for example, when I was in Prague watching the current news, the way they were reporting the Gulf War was so different than the way it was in the US, where in the US it was like, and much more transparent about the horrors, really, right? Whereas in the US, I think they even had like a concerted strategy. There was no coffin shown on TV. It was like being, there was a kind of control of this. And then these days, it's so confusing now because you have the media. It's just, you have, there's a whole different media landscape for these things. But I'm talking about, I guess, the formal institutions of media, not the social media that we have now. So anyway,
well, and I mean, thinking about that's interesting. This accordion telescoping act of time there, being now reflected on 20 years ago. And I'm thinking of that same era, like the early 2000s, because that's when I first came to Europe as well. As an 18-year-old, right after high school, I planned a European backpacking trip with a couple of my very best friends at the time. And and we went, and I was thinking right after, so I remember, that was the summer of 2002. So 9/11 had happened the year before. And I guess maybe that Iraq war was already starting, or there was rumblings of it. But there was this sense. I remember talking with some other travelers who put Canadian patches on their backpacks. So we didn't do that. We kind of just rolled with it and such. But there was certainly the sense that being an American, I don't know, there was something potentially risky about it, I guess. Or there was just an anti-American apathy or antipathy out in the air. Whether that ever amounted to violence or, I'm not sure, but nonetheless, it is interesting to have that, to feel that. And, but also to have these overlapping senses of history and historical remembrance. And I agree with you that now it's the act of that historical remembrance and the filters through which we think about the past and the present are so much more like fragmented and prismatic.
Yes.
So,
Yes.
but it is,
You know,
yeah. What do you think about that?
well, all that's all. I mean, all I was thinking about that Canadian flag thing the other day. In Eastern Europe, just for like the record's sake, when I was there at that time, there was still a very like strong positive association. So with the United States, especially among older people, it was still seen as this country of freedom. The imperialism was somehow, I don't know, they were less attuned to it because they still saw it as they were still measuring it against previous invasions, right?
Sure.
But yeah, I mean, I guess maybe one thing, even way back then, but to this day, one of the challenges is how I said I didn't feel connected to the nation state and the state, I guess, the state form and the actions of the state. And that can be a cop out. I mean, we, you know, like we are as a citizen, like, you know, you don't have, but anyway, I guess where I wanted to kind of go is like, even back then, but still to this day, I like to think a lot about what are the things of the US or American or North American culture that I feel connected to or love and think are beautiful and have contributed to the world. So just to kind of weave this together, like in Prague, as I recall, they had all these jazz clubs. It was like a really big thing. And I don't know if it's still like that, but in Central Europe, like particularly in Prague, jazz had been this like huge thing in the mid 20th century, this kind of like bohemian and it was all like white Central Europeans, right? And this is like, you know, a black cultural form from the United States, but a real new cultural form, right? Like a form that really was, in a sense, created not by the state, right? So I'm not talking about the state, but in the cultural history of the place. And I feel like one of the sadnesses about being, I mean, that's not our mainstream, like that's not the pop culture, but there's so much rich cultural history and cultural contributions that I try to like stay connected to. And as an example, like, and this is one of the things about being an expat that I sometimes find difficult. I actually find music one of the, so like I can get really into literature and from other places. I love it. Painting, architecture, but music, I really feel really connected to the music from North America. And it just doesn't, that's one thing I really miss when I have been an expat in Europe, but also somewhat in Canada, although Canada has tons of musicians are Canadian.
Yes, a lot more than you realize, right? Yeah.
A lot more than you realize. Yeah. So, but just like, I think, that isn't so embodied. That's how I've had this conversation with lots of people. Like the music seems so embodied, and it really depends a lot on like where you grew up, you know, like that embodied level of the music you heard when you were really young, and like sort of like you don't have the same reaction when you hear music from other countries. You can get into it and it can be interesting, certainly, but it doesn't hit you at that like visceral place where you're like, this takes me to like this like sort of core place. Yeah. Anyway, what do you think about that? Does that make sense?
It does. Yeah. No, I can really relate. And I think, I mean, what that makes me think of in my experience here, there's been many times when I felt somewhat homesick since moving to Germany. I mean, you know, I mean, I've always been open to living in different places, and you know, I love my family, and you know, I'm from the Denver area, and I have a lot of roots there. But there is something culturally that is missing here. And when I've been especially homesick or down, then that's when I'll want to listen to classic country music. So I'll just like play lots of Hank Williams, lots of Roy Orbison, early Elvis, like. Stuff like that. And that's a lot of the stuff that I grew up hearing. And now it takes on different meaning for me because you don't really hear that stuff here at all. I mean, I guess there's some, you know, like niche interest in it, but it's not part of the cultural background in a way like it was in the certain places I grew up. So I'm even considering doing like a Hank Williams cover band because I think nobody else is doing that Nobody else is doing that in Stuttgart, so I don't know.
That's, and another thing I remember about, and this is again applies more to Europe than Canada, because the music. But anyway, I remember finding also very interesting how certain North American musicians that were big in North America weren't that big in Europe. And then there were people who were bigger in Europe that weren't that big in the US. So as I was thinking, like Tom Waits had like a very, and I'm thinking more like within the, I don't know what you want to call it, the demographic or the sort of niche music I was already interested in. But like Tom Waits was really big in Central Europe. Like if you went into a record store, they had all Tom Waits records. But like Neil Young, for example, was never, I mean, he's a world artist, obviously, but he wasn't like cool, if you know what I mean. Like different things are like cool in different ways, in different countries. Similar with writers, like the Czechs really like Charles Bukowski. Like they'd have all his books in Czech.
Okay, I can see that connection with Tom Waits and Bukowski. Both have something.
Yes.
Yeah.
I think kind of, and Bukowski is originally German, I believe. I think his father was a German soldier. He was actually born in Germany after World War II, but then his mother was American, I believe. But anyway, just I always find that kind of interesting. What artists art forms, cultural figures, creative people may catch on in different places, in different ways. Something about their work catches on, but I know exactly what you mean about that. I love Roy Orbison, but the only way that kind of country or rootsy, folky stuff translates is almost as kitsch. It doesn't, and I love folk music and early blues and yeah, when I would get homesick when I was in Europe in particular, I would just really gravitate towards that music, and it felt like connected to the land in a way. Like it can translate, and people could be scholars of it, that sort of thing, but it didn't have quite the same. It felt, there's something about it, and that's not. I don't face that quite as much in Canada, and Canada also has really one of the things that I've really liked becoming more accustomed to in Canada is that Canada itself, as I'm sure you've had a similar experience, as Americans, we tend to, well, I don't want to make too many generalizations, but it's Canada. It's like a homogenous place, but it's not at all. Like it has very distinct, different cultural regions. So I had the good fortune to be in Newfoundland last year, a couple of years ago, for a philosophy thing, which is, if you look on a map, I was in St. John's. It's the farthest east city in North America. And it's like a different place. They have this kind of Irish lilt to their speech. It's very influenced by Ireland. And they have a kind of original folk music that's also kind of Irish folky, but with a Canadian spin. It's very cool. It's just very cool. So but it's close enough because it has like some of the folk roots are closer to what I remember from the US, right? It feels not quite as distant or something like that. My ancestors also actually came down from not Newfoundland, but Nova Scotia, and then migrated down into the North America, or northern US. So I do feel like there's some sort of connection at some level.
I think you and I both have pretty broad views of what philosophy is and what it can do, and aren't very exclusive or gatekeepy about what it shouldn't be. But nonetheless, like in distinguishing that philosophy is something, and in coming at having like a disciplinary background in philosophy, like what about the arts and culture interests you philosophically? Or put differently, like how does philosophy help you maybe describe or get at that feeling or that certain something in a way that other things wouldn't? So like maybe we don't even need philosophy to think about that stuff. We can just do it directly as artists, or I don't know, riff on that.
I love this question, David. Do we have like 5 days? I mean, this is awesome. I mean, this is exactly so I try to be coherent. When I get excited, I tell my students, it's when someone says something that excites me, then like all bets are off for how coherent I can be, because I just start going like, so anyway,
Good.
But I mean, so
I'm glad I got you excited, Russell. That's a feather in my cap for the day.
There's a few different questions there that, I'm not going to be able to approach that systematically. I think I'll just start with, because there's the question of like sort of a meta question, like what can philosophy do, or what is philosophy's role in these things? And I have thoughts about that, but I think I'll focus more on like this question of, so not to get too technical, but one of my current philosophical figures who I'm really interested in is a kind of understudied North American philosopher, Susan Langer. And Susan Langer was a student of Whitehead's, Alfred North Whitehead, and also Ernst Cassirer. She wasn't formally a student of Ernst Cassirer's, but she was heavily influenced by Ernst Cassirer. She's born in New York City, but to German immigrant parents, and she read German. She was fluent in German and English, and anyway, she had a really interesting, very active, very productive, but not studied it at the depth that it should be. But that's kind of my academics. I don't want to get too in the weeds on that. But so she has this book called Feeling and Form, which is about philosophy of art, but it's really the ontology of feeling, like thinking of art as creating what she calls forms of feeling. And what I think is interesting about this is we tend to hear the word feeling and we immediately psychologize, because obviously we are psychological beings, and our experience of feeling is generally like, in a common sense way, like I feel happy, I feel sad, like it's always linked to us as a subject. But one of the things that I've always been interested in is thinking about, and this is why art, like thinking about what art is and what art can do, when you don't make it, when you start to understand that there is something objective. It's not it's a tricky line to run, but there's something real that's being created and expressed in works of art that has to do with feeling, but is separate from the personal psychology of the creator or the perceiver. Right. This is what, or at least this is what I'm interested in. And Susan Langer helps me to think about that. And I mean, Deleuze is in the background for some of this, but I guess I think the place where this becomes intuitive for people with different backgrounds is I'm really interested in this question in relation to our experiences of art, and art understood really broadly, like all the different modalities from different times and places and perhaps different cultures. So it's an example I often use in Denver when I was, I don't know, young and kind of in a sort of wild period of my life, very moving a lot. And I would just find myself in museums sometimes. And there was no like system. I wasn't like thinking of in a kind of scholarly way, but I would just go to what I was attracted by. And I remember being in the Denver Art Museum and having this really powerful experience seeing actually totem poles, which were from the indigenous people of the Pacific Northwest. The fact that it was in the Denver Art Museum as a work of art is a whole nother, I mean, that's a whole different kind of discussion because
sure.
But so the point is that I felt like I had I was touched by this piece in some way. It felt powerful and real to me, that had a kind of presence. And so then the question is like, how much of that is my projection, and how much of that is how capable are we of getting something, some human connection, I might say, across cultural boundaries, space-time boundaries. Another example is like looking at classical Chinese painting from, like 10th century. I just made up that number, but I mean, they have a really rich tradition of landscape painting. It looks totally different than landscape painting in Europe, which comes a lot later, actually.
Sure.
But so I can look at it and I feel drawn to certain pieces. I feel like there's some, as a human being, I feel like there's some communication of feeling, to go back to this concept of feeling. But I don't have cultural expertise. I don't have certainly no cultural lived experience. And when I have some colleagues from China now who I'm in dialogue with about some of this, they see the piece so differently, because they're like, they have all this cultural awareness of the history, and I'm just seeing this, that literally the ink on the canvas. It's not canvas, it's silk, but and it's speaking to me in some way as a human being. But so this is, I guess, what I'm interested in as a philosopher, both the positives and the negatives of this. Like we don't have full access to other times and places, and yet it seems like art is this way that humans can communicate across the world in a phenomenological sense, like across the cultural life world, right? And so given that we live in a time of deep change, I see art as a way of sort of navigating that, because we can, this is anyway. So now I'm jumping all over the place, but I'm really interested in these questions, and it's an ontological question for me, not a psychological one or even a cultural one. So I'm not talking about like how the cultural understanding of art understands itself. This is where philosophy comes in. I'm actually thinking about how is it possible that we feel things or don't, right? And it's also one of the things that's really interesting. It's not efficient causation. Like it's not like automatic. It's not and you can look at the same piece one day and just be like, wow, and then the next day just be like, eh. Right. So if this, anyway, so that went on long enough, but hopefully I answered it.
No, you did. Well, let's roll with it a little bit longer. Like let me put a follow up to you this way, like, because it sounds to me what you're describing could be called like a view of art, like the universal status of art or power of art. Like, what's your view about the universalism? Because say, like, take Immanuel Kant, who's someone I've worked on a lot, and he was quite influential in aesthetics and in defining art in relationship to human beings. But one of his claims, which, love it or leave it, a lot of people reject it, but is that art and an aesthetic experience, at least in fine art, is fairly universal, because it speaks what is, let's say, beautiful about it or sublime, but let's focusing on beauty. And he thinks beauty is kind of a feeling that is universal. That is to say, everybody would find this beautiful. It transcends cultural specificity, and the universality comes because of the shared cognitive structures that all humans or rational agents have who would appreciate the art. So, and that goes in this direction of, can we identify like universal parameters for art or an artistic aesthetic experience? So it sounds like in one way you're going in that direction, that you would say, like with that Chinese art, that even if you don't have the cultural background or the linguistic background, you can still, there's something in the art that's communicated to you, or that there's an exchange or an experience there that is somewhat universal. And so what do you think about that? And I guess maybe another thought that I have connected to this is maybe like an anthropological concept, because I know that you and I are also both interested in prehistory and in evolution, and thinking about human culture and art in the context of nature and the non-human. So is it also, there's like early cave art here around Stuttgart in Southwest Germany. There's some of the oldest human artistic artifacts, like little carvings of lion heads, and they're, little, there's like a Venus, a very early Venus carving, things like that. So the question is, are there almost like archaic artistic works that, because we're a human, we all can connect to? I don't know. What do you think about that? What do you think about the universal and then this prehistoric horizon?
Yeah. Also awesome questions. So really psyched. I just was teaching Kant a couple of weeks ago. The Kant's aesthetics. I've been teaching it a lot.
Apologies to your students.
Well, yeah, but it's so exciting. It's so I love how like intuitive and counterintuitive it is at the same time. It's like anyway, but I'm not an expert. So and also I don't. Well, anyway, I'll take that question on first, and then the prehistoric one second, which is also really interesting. How do I and so I guess I'll do kind of almost like a biographical, the transfer for listeners who aren't familiar with with this terminology. I'm just going to use the term, rather than universal, I'm going to use the term transcendental in a Kantian sense, and just quickly sketch it, which is, Kant's project was trying to discover the transcendental conditions of all experience, right? And I'm, David, just try not to correct me when I get things a little wrong, right? So it is a kind of universal, and he thought we could get to these kind of universal transcendental categories. And for him, right, working backwards from experience, and thus those would be, this isn't his language, maybe my language, transcultural. They would go across cultures, right? And so I was, I think one of the challenges is that, and one thing that I've changed a lot since I was in graduate school. So I used to be really skeptical of that project, primarily because of what it enabled in the world. So it wasn't necessarily on philosophical terms. It was more that, Kant was also had a, explicitly racist anthropology. And, I don't think he would be that way if he was alive today, but like that kind of transcendental, and he was quite confident that he had discovered the transcendental categories.
Mm-hmm.
So
like once and for all, at the exclusion of all other alternatives.
Exactly. So it's one thing to think that that's a possibility, or even that it could exist. It's another thing to think that we know what they are. Mm-hmm. And I think this isn't Kant so much, but it's one of the ways in which a kind of lazy Kantianism enabled it's a complicated story, but at least at a conceptual level, enabled some of the harms of the colonial period, is when you encountered human beings whose ways of being seemed to your mind to not line up with your conception of rationality. And you think we have the transcendental categories of rationality, and you don't do the work to try to get deeper into understanding the logics, then you're just like, these people are clearly inferior, right? Mm-hmm. So I was always really worried about that transcendental project, not on philosophical terms necessarily. I hadn't thought this through at this level, but just at this very visceral level, like, oh, that really worries me when you start thinking you have the universal categories, but they're so clearly culturally located, right? Mm-hmm. And I would say, since I've been here at King's under the influence of one of my colleagues who's a Kassir scholar, so Kassir, a neo-Kantian, one of the Kassir scholars. There's not too many of them in North America, more in Germany and Japan actually, but and who's very, and Kassir was interested in a transcendental philosophy of culture. So I've come to recognize that maybe there's something we provided we're very careful and very humble, there's still something about this universal or transcendental kind of work that philosophy does, specifically to philosophy, right? Because it's not the whole thing, and this is why it's so hard for lots of people to wrap their heads around. It's not, Kant's categories are not cultural categories. They're a few removes of abstraction behind that. So, anyway, and to connect this, though, my impulse, and this is really, Susan Langer is really doing this kind of work also, is to think of it not, Kant is too ontological and too logical, I think. It's really, and he's really downplays feeling, and as a result, embodiment. Mm-hmm. So can we think about a transcendental phenomenology of affect, right? Mm-hmm. Of feeling. So the way that feeling gets translated or culturally understood is going to vary wildly, but all human beings are feeling beings, right? Mm-hmm. All human beings feel. As I said, the way the culture mediates their feeling can vary really wildly, right? And this is why it's important to it's not a psychological project, right? Mm-hmm. I mean, psychology is important and interesting, but you're already in the kind of cultural life world when you're doing psychology. So can we think about patterns of feeling that perhaps could be conceived of as universal, and yet are not just directly read off of our own psychological experience, right? So this is the thing that I'm kind of interested in, like interest, sure. and that's where the art comes into play. I hope I'm not going too long. So just really
well, let me press that into the prehistorical. And so, like, if there are patterns of feeling, And, you know,
Yeah.
maybe that's like, is that humans, you know, like for
Right.
human beings and does that mean that the human species, you know, like modern humans who emerged, 200,000 years ago? And are those patterns of feelings specific to us such that
Right.
other, let's say like Homo habilis or early hominids maybe don't have them, or, you know, chimpanzees today or mice or lizards or fish,
Right.
you know, is that specific to us? So I guess that was maybe my question there with the cave art too, is like, is there something almost, you said like transcultural, is it like is this an anthropological
Right.
transcultural
Right.
experience?
Right.
Or is it something else?
Well, so I mean, if speaking for myself and more or less fully speculatively,
Sure. No, that's the best kind of speaking in my view.
no, I mean, that's why I actually think it's important to keep in mind that actually feeling is before species or human or organism. So that's why I want to call it ontological. And this is again more speculative, although Langer's 3-volume Mind, an essay on human feeling, gives an evolutionary account. So there is something that it's not to say that the feeling of the microbia is the same as a human feeling, but that the life feels. So there's feeling and life are kind of like correlative categories. And I think Deleuze is actually really helpful here. I mean, Deleuze talks about animals as artists in a certain way. And like, obviously that's not in the, I mean, you have to be able to make a sort of speculative suspension of disbelief. But I think on principle, the idea would be feeling comes first. Whatever the category of human is a certain, has a certain, or have certain constitutive patterns of feeling that make us human, but it's not a divide. There's not a hard line between human as feeling beings and other life forms as non-feeling beings. It's rather that life and feeling, right? They have different forms of feeling. That's why I'm interested in this forms of feeling thing in Langer, right? But that it's ontological in a more basic way than human being. To go to the prehistoric, since we haven't gotten there, and I mean, the other piece on this, and this is something that's really newer. I wasn't doing this in grad school much, partially because of where we were, but I've really gotten interested in philosophy of religion, and I've been employed. All of my jobs have been at Catholic universities because they hire continental philosophers. Still.
Yeah, my job, my position in the U.S. was also at a Catholic university. So,
yes.
Yeah,
and I'm not a practicing Catholic, although I have, but in any case, I am really interested in spiritual religion questions, and I do think art and religion are closely related ontologically. So that prehistoric question is this, to me, it comes out of awe, wonder. I mean, I don't know. Yeah. Divine is a word that's going to trigger some people, so I don't know about that. But like this creative impulse, and actually, Edward Glissant is really good on this. Who's another figure that I'm gotten much more into since graduate school, and French. Well, he's from Martinique, and he in the academy they often would call him post-colonial, but he's a philosopher, poet, novelist. Just awesome. He's just awesome. I just love his work. But he has these passages in his where he's really talking about the poetics of the earth as being like primordial. So this is this prehistoric thing, like this primordial impulse to sing, this primordial, and it really isn't. It's come. So again, to go back to your question about like, is this an anthropological? Well, maybe, but not in the sense of like as a division between human and non-human. It's rather that if the source of these creative impulses, in a sense, is life or the earth, and then it gets channeled into really complex and sedimented ways over time, right? And can get very. I actually I won't use the word. I was gonna, so I won't use it, but it gets highly cultivated. We'll use that. We'll say that.
In different, and the human is one of those cultivations, perhaps.
Exactly. Yeah. Yes, and in different ways, right? In different ways. But the impulse that prehistoric. I mean, I haven't gone to. Next time I'm in Germany, I'll have to go look at some of these if you can. I know you can't go to some of the caves.
Well, a lot of them are visible in museums, but there's also and many of them were found in caves. They were just like very well preserved. So there's some great caves that I can take you into. So
Awesome.
Speaking of so why don't let's go slide back into our own little caves for a minute here and take a quick break. So we'll be right back.
I was just going to say, you wrote me a handwritten letter that I got several years ago, which I just was so thankful for. And I've been working on a response, and it's literally been years. So
no, that's fine. That's the good. Those things are timeless. They like, so long as it comes before I die, then I'll be satisfied,
Okay. I used to
if
write
it comes afterwards, it can be buried with me, So
when I was in my 20s, I was a real letter writer, like physical, and they were like works of art. I was carried on all sorts of correspondences, and now email basically killed them. And now professional life has just, but anyway, so I just wanted to acknowledge that I was really happy to get that letter from you.
Ah, that's sweet of you, man. Yeah, no, I'd love that reply anytime. Okay. I have, because off here on the side I have a typewriter. I don't. That one is probably handwritten, or was it typewritten? I can't recall.
No, it was typed. Yeah.
Okay. Yes. So,
and I used to have a typewriter. I always typed on a typewriter through the, I guess, late 90s and maybe early aughts. And then somehow, so my son, who's 5, it's really interesting how people have different minds, and he has this very mechanical mind, much more than mine. He's always figuring out how things work really quickly, and he's really interested in how things work. And so we were reading something, and there was a reference to a typewriter. And so I said, yeah, you know what a typewriter is? And he said, no. And I said, it's this. And then he started like theorizing a typewriter. He's like, oh, and he was like, so I'm like, I got to get a real one so he can like see how it works, because it's so awesome. There's no mystery to it. You press this down, this moves through, hits it's just awesome. So anyway,
bunch of levers, little, the mechanics are incredible. On this channel, I want to do some typewriter reviews, actually, because I got about 50 typewriters here. Like, I had a spring where I went on like a spending spree, kind of, that went almost a little too far, but of buying like used typewriters, because there's just tons of them in Germany. It's a typewriter collector's paradise. Like, I collected typewriters to some extent before in the US, but here, just because so many more were made in Germany and everybody had them, so they're cheaply available, like a lot of very nice typewriters. But I'll send you one if I don't know. I mean, maybe the duty on it would be a little much, but you should find one.
We'll figure it out. I used to have this Olympia, and I had a case, like I could carry it, like it had and it's just awesome. I just loved it so much. I got it at a flea market in Seattle in the mid 90s, but now you don't see them much anymore. You really don't see them much. So, but that's cool that you have.
They're kind of dying out. They're kind of dying out, in like a generation, they're just getting that old that, it's like there still are really older people who use typewriters in their professional and personal lives, and who still have them, who are now passing away, and their kids or grandkids inherit them. But in another generation, so it's one of those interesting artifacts.
Yes.
Well, let me bend this. Let's bend this into the topic. So, like, we were talking about art and religion at the end there, and this is intergenerational aspects with typewriters, mnemonics, letter writing, meaning, art. And I wonder if, like, what you think about this. And let me put this a bit more narrowly. So this channel is called Deadbeat Philosophy. And one thing I'm asking this first round of guests in particular is about death. So I want to ask you, like, how does death factor in there in how you think about art and religion? I know there's like Bataille or certain thinkers in the history of philosophy who've made a lot out of death and its relationship to art and religion. But and then for you, it's like, you're like, well, it's safe to say we're both middle-aged dudes, right? Like, I don't know, I know you're in your 20s, but I think you're middle-aged in my book.
I had a momentous birthday last September.
Oh, nice.
I changed decades. So I'm no one could deny I am absolutely middle-aged, potentially likely past the midpoint.
Okay.
Yeah.
Very good. It's a broad midpoint, but so feel free to connect to your own life. Like you're middle age, you've checked off certain boxes. You got a family, you got the tenure track job, you published your book. You how are you feeling about your own death? But then so that's a big question, but I'd love to hear what you think about all that.
Yeah. Also a great question. Could go in lots of different directions.
Yeah, feel free to pull out a few, and then just weave them back together.
Yeah.
Or not.
I mean, I think that it's a little hard. I mean, it's a great question. It's really good. I'm just trying to decide like how I want to answer it, because on the one hand, some of the figures that I'm working with, and when I was talking about feeling and life and all these things, actually those, we might say this, Spinoza, for example, a wise man thinks about death least of all, right? And he has this very death is not something to be concerned about. And Deleuze,
like almost like a living philosophy, like a philosophy of life affirmation.
Yeah, and Bergson, like Deleuze, this kind of this lineage has been really influential to me, and I resonated with it in some regards, but I would also say that I really frequently talk about this. Socrates' philosophy is learning how to die. And I also generally link this to issues of climate change, eco-anxiety, and spiritual practice, contemplative practice, which I think these are all sort of interests of mine, both personally and also philosophically. And I do think, so like I'm throwing names around here and I don't mean to do that, but that's just, anyway. So Nishitani, a Japanese philosopher, religion and nothingness, who is, and I have much more so than graduate school, a big shift is I tend to keep this. I practice Zen. We'll just say that. So now it's on the record.
Yeah, no, I dig it.
Some of these.
I do too. I think everybody does in their own way, right? I mean, that's part of what Zen is. Like,
so I think that all spiritual traditions are at some level. Not the nominal doctrinal, like I am this, but rather like if we really want to get into what it means to practice things contemplatively, a big part of it means encountering your mortality and death. I mean, Nishitani calls it the great death, right? The great death, which is, and I know that in the West, like the existentialists, I mean, this comes up again and again. But how does that link to art? I mean, there's different ways. I mean, and I am, I guess, susceptible to the idea that art, not as an attempt to sort of like undo death, but as to make something quasi-permanent that stops time, right? That the work of art, in a sense, stops time. Actually, Bob Dylan said that in one of his more. He rarely says things that straight, but like he said, what art is about trying to stop time. But of course,
he said that in an interview. You mean, so not in the lyrics of a song, but
not in the lyrics, not in a fake interview, because a lot of them he's just playing, but in like a moment where. But he says, but of course that's impossible, and so that contradiction actually I think is quite interesting.
Totally.
So there's this impulse to celebrate, to affirm, not your personal. That's I think the important part. That's actually what Socrates is talking about, right? To affirm something that's bigger than you, that we might say is eternal. But any given work of art is going to crumble. I mean, one of the things, and yet it doesn't crumble as fast as the human body.
Usually. I mean, it depends on your art. If you make it out of some like clay that is not water safe and you leave it out in the rain, or a snowman, the snowmen are very, snow people are very ephemeral.
Yes. But actually this is also a place where maybe the cultural, because on the other hand, and some of the more like Eastern traditions and this notion of valorizing ephemerality, that all beauty is just in a moment, right? It's all. So I do think like I tend to be really allergic to West, East, even though it just, my students do it a lot. But there is this tradition in Western thought to seek the eternal, going back to Plato, really, right? To seek something that doesn't change. And I think that does inflect the way people think about art. they want to make this masterpiece that in a sense outlives them.
Mm.
But
That's like timeless. That's
it's
like
timeless. Yeah, like
beauty. It communicates with art itself.
exactly. But maybe maybe that comes with a lot of baggage that, on the other hand, we can also think about the beauty of the small moment, the ephemeral, this like instant, the event that's beautiful but disappears and leaves maybe only a little trace or something like this, right? So I don't know how that goes with death exactly, but I mean, I do think that the existential elements of philosophy, which one in my teaching is one of the things I focus on a lot, I do think humans, a lot of the, I do think learning how to die is part of what it is to really explore and contemplate. Learning that our personal mortality is, yeah, I feel like I'm just saying platitudes now.
No, I mean, platitudes it's like truisms, a truism remains true despite being a truism. But I couldn't agree more with this right now. I'm doing like a children's philosophy series here. Like, you can check it out on the webpage, but it's like, every month, there's like a little puppet show. And so I'm writing some songs for that. And one of them was about Socrates and like trying to introduce the kids to Socrates, but also covering Socrates' death. And, it's like packaging that in like a kid's way. That's kind of like, philosophy is about a certain way of relating to death, and it's okay to talk about that. It's also like good to talk about life, and like those are both there, and like one shouldn't cancel out the other.
Right.
I see that with Zen and like the non-duality stuff. I mean, since moving to Germany, I've actually explored some of that stuff a little bit more. And certainly with Taoism, like the Tao Te Ching, I had an old copy of it that I rediscovered since moving here and dug into that. And so I like those ideas. And also with Taoism and with opposites being connected and an underlying unity of things. I like that. And I think that life and death are helpfully thought about in those ways. But also you can see Kant or Hegel or canonical philosophers also in these terms in some way. So it's kind of a nice outlook that helps you to re-examine the past and to, I don't know, I guess have a critical eye on the present.
Yeah.
But you could go, I guess I'm saying, but can you go too far with that? Is it like, then does death become this quotidian thing? It's like if we're overly comfortable with death, is something about death, something about the magic or the power of death is that it's almost like, it's inherently untouchable or something, or it should be kind of off to the limits. It should be taboo.
I think that's interesting. I mean, I do think, so I tend to lean more toward, like when you brought up Japanese philosophy, there's a word in Japanese, shoji, which is life, death. It's one word, right? That you can't have one without the other. And I'm certainly drawn to those sorts of things. But then I think it's Levinas. I'm not a fan of this claim, but I think it's relevant here. I think he's wrong, frankly, but I understand where he's coming from, and where he basically says the problem with Buddhism is that they don't have a concept of death as the ultimate alterity, right? And also, I mean, reincarnation complicates this as well. But I agree that there's like, if death becomes this quotidian, we should just be comfortable with it. But I don't really see how that's actually possible existentially, right? I mean, I can see how it's like a different conceptual lens where you maybe sit with both, so you're not afraid of it. You try to become in touch with it, but I just don't see how that would ever become quotidian, because it is such a powerful, in our humanness. It's such a, like, actually, one thing I sometimes think about with regard to death is like a lot of people focus on fear of their own death, but to me, the more powerful thing to wrestle with is loss of loved ones. Right. So it's not so much that I'm going to die, not my loved ones are going to die or have died. Right. And so, I mean, I'm not like psyched to die. I'm looking forward to trying to stay here as long as I can. But it doesn't create like this sense of terror in me. Whereas losing people is really such a powerful experience and hard
Yeah.
and something you have to wrestle with. And I don't see how that could ever become quotidian, just like, oh, that's okay. Right. So the concept,
Mm-hmm.
but I do see how like different ways of thinking about it may help us to remain affirmative. And I don't know, and I do. And the other piece is, I think, in challenging times, people need, like, and this is not meant to be a finger pointing claim at all, right? To others.
Mm-hmm.
It's really about ourselves. We need to try to like find these rudders so that we're not being manipulated through fear, right? And so when people are so afraid of mortality, they're much more easily manipulated, and much more. I think there's something about courage that this would be part of the Zen point. Once you've died, you haven't literally died, you're still alive, but once in a sense you've experienced ego death, then you're actually a much more courageous being in the world, because the worst thing has already happened. I'm not saying I haven't experienced this, right? I'm not making a claim, like a pedestal claim, but I think conceptually that makes sense to me.
That you're like not so connected to yourself, or not so dependent or attached to yourself.
Exactly. Yes.
And
exactly. And Nishitani calls this actually the great conversion. And all of a sudden, like, the whole polarity of the world reverses, and it's no longer just focused on yourself, and then you are for others, right? So it's both an ethical and ontological thing in Nishitani that I think is really interesting. And he sees it as a process, like it's always happening. It's not like a light switch that you flip and now it's more like, it's like it has to be renewed, right? It's like so there's the conceptual conversion, but it's not like a existential event that it's like, now I'm good. Like, now I live in this other way. It's more like it's always returning. It's always this kind of cycle of attachment and the great death, or something like this. Again, speaking just conceptually, not that we can speak just conceptually, but I just want to make clear that I'm not speaking as if I'm trying to sort of elevate my own experience in some way, because I'm just as quotidian.
Well, it seems if there's one set of experiences that you ought to elevate, it could be your own. I mean, you know them firsthand, right? Yeah.
Well, I guess what I'm saying is I haven't experienced the great death. That's what I'm trying to say.
Oh, okay.
I don't feel like
not yet.
Yeah, not yet. Yeah. But anyway, I wasn't expecting that question, but I really appreciate it. I think it's a really good question. And to me, it's one of the places where, to go back all the way back to when you were asking about like philosophy, I think it's one of the things that philosophy, in the broad way that we like to think of it, like not as a sort of narrow profession, but in this sort of I think philosophy at its best gives us, it doesn't shy away from those kinds of questions, and that can become sort of, like a caricature of itself, right? But
sure.
The death-obsessed philosopher or whatever. But I just think it's something really vital and important about that. And there's that vital, right, for life, for a good life, So anyway, it's good. Yeah.
Life, death. That vitality. So I think that was a very vital conversation, Russell, and I'm very grateful that we had it. So we'll have to keep that vitality. We'll keep it alive. Like that one's not going to go away. But I'll shift now to ask you the last question. So, which is whether related to any of this or related to anything at all in your life or that you're thinking about. I wonder if you have some recommendations for us. 3 items, a book, film, album, in any order that you'd recommend for the audience.
Okay, good. So, well, I hope I'm not spilling the beans to the audience. I knew this question was coming, but I didn't plan until the last. Fourth wall. It's always really hard for me to choose, so I'm very happy that it's not being framed as my favorites. But I did come up with an album, a film, and a book in the course of our conversation. The one that's probably, and these are all, so anyway, the album, and this is probably the most obscure, and I don't know why, I just think, so the album is by, it's a side project. So the the band that has larger profiles called the Dirty Three, and they are a band. I don't know what genre, post rock or something like this, from Australia, and this is a side project with at least two of those members called the Tren Brothers, Tren Brothers, and the album is called The Blue Tree. The Blue Trees. Is that right?
I'll double check as well. I'll put a link in the show notes for each of these recommendations.
Good. It's certainly around, and it's really outtakes and stuff. But the reason why I chose it is I just like it, and so when we started with music and we were talking about that visceral thing of music, but B, I like something about it because it's instrumental music, guitar, drums, and sometimes violin, and it has this way of feeling like it's about to fall apart and weaving beauty right on the edge of dissolution. I listen to it. It's my current go-to. I just really like it. It weaves this kind of spell, but in this way that's obviously they're really sensitive musicians, but the edge of falling apartness. That's what I like about it. It's it's not like a tight band. Do you know what I mean? But it's got all this space in it, but it makes sense. So anyway, that's my music selection. My book selection came up as we were talking in the last few minutes, and it's not a very well-known book, and it can be hard to find, but it's a book called Coffin Man. Coffin Man, a journal of a Buddhist mortician.
Coffin Man?
No, like coffin, like Coffin. Coffin Man, a journal of a Buddhist mortician by a man named Shinman Aoki, Aoki. I could send you... And it's a memoir, very slender memoir. It has been translated into English, of a guy, a man in Japan, 20th century, who was starting to be a writer but wasn't super successful. And he got essentially a gig of preparing corpses. And it's a beautiful meditation on death, religion, life, in this really accessible way. It's got a lot of philosophy, but it's also his life. It's this... It's really intense. And he, as a mortician, he's the first, in a sense, the first responder lots of times to go get bodies from people's homes who have died. And then so I highly recommend this book.
That's great. Really, that's right up my alley. I'm going to seek that one out at the Stuttgart Public Library right after this conversation.
Let me know if you can find it, because it can be hard to find, but and then the film is a film that I recently rewatched for the first time in 30 years. It's a little edgy. I used to watch films a lot, and I don't watch films hardly ever anymore. And I definitely don't watch edgy films since I became a parent.
You gotta leave those ones. Those are a little too edgy for a family man, right?
Yeah, well, I just, my capacity for these things just really shifted, and all of a sudden I would just. But anyway, I pushed past the initial disturbance, and I just find it an incredible work of art. So this is the film Lost Highway by David Lynch, who recently passed away, and it's why I rewatched it. And it is deeply disturbing. So I in these days, I sometimes joke with students. I'll just say it has 1 million trigger warnings. It should have a trigger warning for anything, every trigger there is. Just don't go in. It's not for the faint of heart, but it's really, I think, a really beautiful work of art, and it's on the edge of sense. So one of the things I like about David Lynch, I think sometimes I can't get some David Lynch movies, and just it's not doing it for me. It's just it makes no sense. But this one also, it's just right on the edge of, it makes deep sense in a way that you can't put into words. That's a cliche, but so I highly recommend it. Just visually, and the sound, and just striking images, deeply disturbing in many cases. But so those are my three, I guess. And I'm not sure. I guess in the context of our conversation, it's I recently watched Lost Highway. B, it's an American artist who's passed away, and so I'm proud of this and it is very American in its sensibility at some level. Sure. And then C, when sometimes discussions about feeling and art focus on and even in Kant, there's this kind of focus on what we might say harmonious feelings. but it's an example of a work of art that's dealing with dark feelings, but in a like really that are also, I think, universal. So I mean, that if human beings are more in touch with the fact that we all have these potentials, right? We're not all puppies and rainbows. Like, we have all sorts of different potentials. We become less anxious and potentially more able to understand and navigate that space in positive, generative ways, right? So in this weird way, even though David Lynch makes these dark films, I think they're not exploitative. That's what I'm trying to say, right? They're not trying to exploit our or, you know, like, or capitalize on darkness. He's making art out of it so that we can be like mature human beings, you know, and mature human beings are aware of this, right? It doesn't mean we're celebrating it. It's more like we're mature about these complexities of what it is to be human. So anyway, those are my three. It's just, I mean, if you like that kind of film, it has a kind of cult status. I'm told. Some people.
Yeah. Great.
Anyway,
great family film too, right? I mean,
don't watch it with your kids. Yeah. Potentially, I mean, it depends on. Yeah, and it's pretty. I'm on record there on that one, I guess. But yeah, I mean, it's
wonderful. Well, yeah, and it brings us together. You know, it's like that dark film like that. It can bring human beings together around something, some shared experience.
Yeah, it can generate conversation too, and also it's not for everyone. I mean, nothing has to be for everyone. So that's the other. You know, if it's not for you, take it or leave it. Kind of. This is another thing I like about art. It's non-dogmatic. Right. Art, you know, even though I used to get in these like intense arguments in university undergrad over music, we understand that, you know, it's not like you can love something and just be like someone else, they don't love it. It's okay. Yeah.
Live and let live.
Live and let live. Exactly.
All right. Well, man, awesome. I'm going to let you live right now, and I hope that you live well and die well when the time comes. But that's a long way in the future.
Hopefully.
And yes, you never know. But in any case, this conversation has been very nice, and it's been really good touching base with you. And I thank you very much for doing this.
Yes, thank you so much, David. What a pleasure. And I hope this podcast just proliferates and it's so cool. It's just so cool. That's my only word for it right now. So awesome. Good to see you.
Thanks very much. Yeah, we'll see, you know, we'll see what happens.
Okay.
In any case, but thanks again, dude. And we'll see you soon. And everybody else, we'll see you on the next episode of
the Deadbeat Philosophy Podcast.
We hope you enjoyed this conversation with
Russell Duvernoy.
The Deadbeat Philosophy Podcast is a co-production of Deadbeat Media and the Museum Hegel-Haus Stuttgart. For more Deadbeat content and to chip in to keep the channel going, check us out at deadbeatphilosophy.substack.com. For more about the Museum Hegel-Haus, check out hegelhaus.de. That's HEGEL-HAUS.de. Adios and auf Wiedersehen.